When I say cannibals, the image that comes to your mind probably isn't a group of white European settlers. Maybe it's because most images feature groups of darker-skinned natives deep in the wilderness, and if you've watched too many cartoons, they're probably dancing around a guy inside of a boiling pot. But what you might not expect is that the myth of the savage cannibal played a crucial role in the colonization of the Americas and was repeated for centuries as justification for genocide and slavery. And who started this fear of rampant cannibalism? Christopher Columbus. Now, I just laid out a pretty big claim that the myth of cannibals had a major impact on the colonization of the New World, but is that actually true? Well, the first and most obvious part of this question seems to be, does cannibalism actually exist as a practice? Here's a quick review. In his book Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History, Bill Shutt notes that there are secondhand and anecdotal accounts from scholars that report instances of cannibalism around the world as part of various rituals and customs, like funerals. And archaeologists think that prehistoric humans were eating people to meet protein demands and to kill off their enemies. But as a source of nutrition, cannibalism just isn't that efficient. Researchers estimate that while animals such as beavers and boars average 1,800 calories per pound of muscle, humans only carry about 650. Think of it as the difference between eating a double bacon cheeseburger with fries and a drink versus just getting the burger and a sad lettuce wrap. On top of that, humans are pretty tricky to catch, making us difficult to hunt unless we're already weak or sick. So while humans may be one of the original components of the paleo diet, it just isn't that filling. And like most of the paleo food I see on Instagram, diseased human meat sounds gross. Okay, so we've established that instances of people eating people are comparatively rare as a dietary measure, which indicates that cannibalism is probably more myth than day-to-day reality. But what does Christopher Columbus have to do with any of this? When he first accidentally landed in the Caribbean in 1492, Columbus arrived and met the friendly Arawaks. They promptly said that their enemies, the Caribs, were man-eaters. Now, this was the first recorded meeting of these two groups, so the accuracy of the translation is pretty important to keep in mind. He writes in his journal that he was told, "A long distance from here there are men with one eye and others with dog snouts who eat men." Later, on November 23rd, 1492, Columbus first wrote the word cannibals as another term for the supposedly dog-snouted Carib people. And this is the first instance where the term cannibal is linked explicitly to a group of people who eat people meat. Now, based on what he wrote in his journals, at first Columbus wasn't sure if he should believe the Arawaks or not. However, he eventually became convinced because he met what he described as a really scary, unattractive Carib whose tribesmen attacked his sailors over a trading argument. He then decided, without a doubt, the people here are evil. They're from the island of Carib and they eat men. All without seeing them, eat men. Oh, and he thought they were hoarding lots of precious metals. Important note. On his way back to Spain in 1493, he wrote a letter which was the status update of its day. He said, "Thus I have found no monsters, nor had a report of any, except in an island, Carib, which is inhabited by people who eat human flesh." This letter was published across Europe and was basically the 15th century equivalent of a viral meme. Short on facts and big on flash. In 1494, Columbus went back to the Caribbean, and this time he was cannibal crazy. In his journals, he claims the most populated islands were filled with cannibals. So he decided that, for the good of the souls of said cannibals, the greater number that are sent to Spain, the better. And by sending over to Spain, he means enslaving them and selling them. For money. So he did that. Convenient because he wasn't finding much gold and he needed to recoup a lot of money for his investors, especially since for his second voyage they gave him 17 ships. He took 500 native people back to Europe to sell as slaves. 200 died on the ride over. But Spanish Queen Isabella wasn't super keen on slaves and sent some of the natives back. Unlike Columbus, Isabella found stealing people and selling them as slaves a bit unchristian. But within 10 years, she changed her tune, all thanks to, you guessed it, cannibals. In 1503, she decreed that all native inhabitants of the newly colonized territory should be protected from capture or injury, except for a certain people who are called cannibals. They may be captured and be sold for money. A few years later, Pope Innocent IV got in on the cannibal craze and supported Isabella's decree, stating that Christians were able to punish cannibalism through brute force, which is a little ironic considering the Catholic Church believed in transubstantiation at the time, which is the idea that people were literally eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood during communion. So what do we get when we add this all up? Well, it looks like cannibals are real, but in this case, European explorers may have invented them to serve their own purposes. Colonial adventurers were grappling with how to deal with native populations. Their base instincts were to dehumanize them to justify forced labor, enslavement, or slaughter. But their professed Christian values of how all humans should be treated denied a clear moral justification for atrocity. So it doesn't really look like a coincidence that shortly after Columbus called indigenous Americans cannibals, Queen Isabella and the Pope came up with the equation that cannibals weren't human and therefore could be enslaved for money. That's up for discussion, but not much discussion. While no historical argument is ever 100%, it seems like cannibalism may have been a pretty convenient justification so everyone could keep making money from slavery. Especially when you consider modern archaeological evidence has found little to nothing to support claims of cannibalism in the Caribbean. Now, there's a certain amount of irony here. Remember at the very beginning of the episode when we said when you think of cannibals, it's probably not white European settlers? Well, turns out a lot of colonists got pretty desperate. Recent evidence has surfaced that the Jamestown colonists in Virginia resorted to cannibalism in 1609. In 1838, crew members of the whaling ship Essex that sailed from Nantucket, Massachusetts, murdered other crew members for food. Additionally, the Donner Party resorted to eating each other during their ill-fated trip to settle the western portion of what is now the United States. So, although cannibalism was often cited as the reason for the need to civilize and colonize other populations, colonization itself often led to real, verified instances of cannibalism. So what do you think? Do you think cannibals were an important part of early colonization? Got any evidence that might suggest otherwise? Let us know down in the comments, and we'll see you next week. So thanks for all your brain-tickling questions from last week on the origins of hashtags. Here's what some of you had to say. So Tia and Mohaxi on the Origin of Everything Facebook page pointed out 3 other uses of the #sign/#. First, the number sign, second, the musical sharp, and third, the tic-tac-toe board. And understanding these were the most popular questions. So I'll start with the number sign. It seems that the use of the hash mark to show number is closely aligned with the pound sign. Since the LB morphed into the pound sign and was already in use for measuring weight by the time it was standardized in the 19th century, bookkeepers began using that same symbol for noting the amount of an object. Hence, the number sign and the pound sign seem to have a pretty similar trajectory. Moving on to the musical sharp. So from what I can find about the history of standardizing musical notation, seems like there were several stages before we reached the sharp. Musical notation began to be standardized around the 13th century so that symbols and lines began to show notes, musical pitches, and rhythm. The sharp sign emerged to mean higher in pitch. Also, the sharp sign is supposed to be different than the hash mark because it's slanted left to right, and most keyboards slant the hash/number sign from right to left. But if we have any musical notation buffs out there who have a longer answer for this, please drop it below and I'll share it. And finally, tic-tac-toe. Weirdly enough, this game also came from the ancient Romans and the ancient Egyptians. Examples of the game have been found sketched into many ancient ruins, and it was called knots and crosses in the 1860s before becoming tic-tac-toe in the US in the 20th century. In 1952, British professor Sandy Douglas made a version of the game for the EDSEC computer called OXO, so many consider it to be the world's first video game. I'll drop a link of the rough history of tic-tac-toe down below. So we'll see you here next week.